Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Rent Prep for Landlords. This is episode number 243, and I'm going to be doing some recent news from the last 7 days, and I'll let you know ahead of time. You know, you're probably a landlord or a property manager, and you're not going to like some of this news, but I'll try to slide in maybe a few goofy or funny stories in the meantime to help lighten it up a little bit. So let's get to that right after this.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Welcome to the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. And now your hosts, Stephen White and Eric Worrell.
All right, we're going to kick it off with a pretty unusual story. I think we've all heard the emotional support animal stories and the craziness that can ensue. Well, this is a new one. This is Joy Henney, who is living in a senior living community center outside of York, Pennsylvania. And he has an emotional support animal, but it's a 4.5-foot alligator. Yeah, so he'll go on walks with his alligator on a leash, and I guess that's nice of him to use a leash. But the article is highlighting how it's pretty unusual, and some people feel a little uneasy, and other people think it's pretty fun to have a alligator in the community center for these senior citizens because somebody needs it. It's crazy. You know, I'm trying to imagine as far as getting emotional support from an animal. I feel like a dog, it might come up and sit in your lap and, be cuddly and gets happy when you come home and sad when you leave and wagging its tail. And I'm just imagining that kind of same relationship that you'd have with an alligator. I mean, does it wag its giant tail as you leave? Does it get excited? Does it open its mouth really wide and let you put your head in it? And not chomp down on your head or, eat the neighbor's dog. I don't know how that works, but I think it's a pretty ridiculous story. So you can check that out at York Daily. I will link to it in the show notes. We're going to be buzzing through some quick stories here. We got a lot. I mean, there's so much recent news, and to be honest, it's all kind of anti-landlord for the most part. But I want to keep you guys up to date on what's going on around the country. This next news story comes from mlive.com on January 18th. And this one was written by Taylor DeOrmua. I'm going to guess on that last name there. But this is for Jackson, Michigan. So landlords must pay for housing when displacing renters, a new ordinance says. So tenants have a matter of hours to find a new temporary home when City of Jackson inspectors shut down rental properties. Sometimes the landlords pay to put displaced residents up in a hotel. Other times it's community leaders or the city itself footing the bill if residents can't find or afford a place to live, city officials said. So a new City of Jackson ordinance, however, would require landlords to set up and pay housing costs for displaced renters for up to 3 months. Tenants wouldn't have to pay rent, Mayor Derek Dobby said, but renters who caused the property to fail inspection aren't eligible. This, to me, takes that penalty away from the victim and places it where it belongs, Councilwoman Colleen Sullivan said. So this ordinance passed 6-1 on the first reading at City Council on Tuesday, January 15th, and will come before the council for a final vote later this month. When I read this story, I guess you could kind of see it from both ways. I like the fact that it's more just for dilapidated properties where, it gets shut down essentially by the local city. And they're saying that this place is no longer habitable. So your tenants need a place to live and you're going to pay the bill for it. That's all good and well as long as that definition of habitable doesn't become kind of crazy. The tough thing with that is there might be judgment calls involved, and I'm trying to think of like a scenario. Let's say that a tenant damaged a sink or created a leak in the house. Well, then it's going to be up to that city official to determine, well, did that tenant create this problem or did the landlord create the problem by being neglectful? Or was it somewhere in the middle? So then it's like, how do you decide? Are you going to have to go to court just to figure out if you're going to have to pay for 3 months potentially of hotel bills? I mean, that could run up a pretty penny real quick. So that's a interesting story coming out of Jackson, Michigan. I've heard of this before, at least similar, where in, I believe it's Portland, Oregon, if you evict a tenant, you have to pay for their moving costs. But this is the first time I'm running across this where you would have to pay for somebody's apartment for or hotel for up to 3 months if your property is shut down by the local inspectors. The other thing to consider here too is you're really incentivizing tenants to essentially snitch, if you want to call it that, on the property. If they don't like something about the way that the property is being managed or don't like their particular situation at this moment, they could upgrade into a hotel and get free breakfast every morning, as long as they're not the reason for the damage or the unlivable situation of that property. So yeah, thank you to Taylor for that article coming out of Jackson, Michigan. So if you got properties out in Jackson, make sure they're in good shape. This next article comes from reason.com, and it's from Christian. Oh man, these last names are tough. Christian Britishigi. Yeah, I'll go with that. From January 18th. And this is talking about that Oregon likely to become the first in the nation to adopt statewide rent control. I'll read you a few paragraphs here. As home and rental prices rise across the country, more and more locals are giving serious consideration to a policy long denounced by economists, rent control. That includes Oregon, which increasingly looks likely to become the first state in the country to adopt rent control statewide. We are long past the point when we should have passed meaningful tenant protection, State House Speaker Tina Kotek says to Willamette Week. Clearly, more needs to be done statewide to give renters more security and stability. So she goes along with her counterpart in the state, Senator Ginny Burdock, have introduced SB 608, which would forbid landlords from increasing rents during the first year of a person's tenancy and would cap future rent increases at 7% per year plus inflation thereafter. So I guess the title, is pretty scary, but you're looking at it, you would be able to still increase the rent 7% per year. The biggest issue I have with this is obviously, it's very heavy-handed and kind of big brother. Essentially, we're going to just cap the profitability of your rentals. One of the things that this article mentions is that it'll probably make housing less affordable, not more. So as we read down further, it says that these caps would apply to all rental properties save for those built within the last 15 years. Currently, there are no vacancy controls in the proposed bill, meaning that landlords would be able to raise rents an unlimited amount once a tenant moves out. For this reason, the bill also bans no-cause evictions. A landlord will have to show a government-approved reason for kicking a tenant out. So these are all controversial policies in Oregon, where there is a state-level preemption on cities passing their own rent control measures, and where a no-eviction bill died in the legislature just 2 years ago. So this goes on further to say that you'd be hard-pressed to find any economist who comes out in favor of rent control as a means to help to improve whatever failure you are experiencing. The chief complaint about rent control is that it reduces the return a landlord or developer can earn from throwing up new units, meaning you'll wind up with fewer overall units, worsening housing affordability in the long run. This holds true for what is being proposed in Oregon, says Wilkerson, though the specifics of SB 608, particularly its 15-year exemption on new buildings and its 7% cap, complicate the picture. So that's probably why they have that 15-year exemption, as they don't want to deter developers from creating new properties. But, if you have your choice of where you're going to build, and if you're going to build here, that in 15 years, your increases on rent are going to be controlled by the government, by the local state, you may not build there. You might go to a different state then if you're, a big developer and you're trying to make financial decisions to help improve your company's situation. So it's a pretty crazy situation out in Oregon. I don't know if it's actually going to get passed, but this is all within the last 4 days as I'm recording this. So we'll keep an eye on that and see what happens with that out in Oregon. A article from 10news.com, and this is posted on January 15th. It is talking about how in San Diego, a county apartment association asks landlords to ease rent on workers hit by shutdown. We got to get a couple government shutdown updates in here. But this is saying that they are asking its member landlords to alleviate the burden on rent-paying federal employees affected by the ongoing government shutdown. It said that the association's roughly 2,000 member landlords that they're asking them to waive late payment fees, accept partial rent payments, and set up alternate rent payment plans for tenants who are federal employees. The association also noted to its members landlords that the federal housing subsidy programs like Section 8 are also affected by the shutdown. So when I read this, my issue with this is we talk a lot on the podcast about, being consistent across the board. And by being consistent, you can limit discrimination. My issue with changing the way that you accept rent, let's say you're not going to charge fees, you are going to do partial rent payments. That's fine if you want to do that for furloughed government employees. But in my opinion, if you're going to do that, you should do that for any single tenant who loses their job because of downsizing or any reason outside of their control, such as a furloughed employee by the government. So to me, it's not fair if you're going to say, government employees, since we're all well aware of what's going on, we're going to reduce your rent those months or accept partial payments. But let's say you worked at, I'm trying to think of a big company that's gone down recently. You worked at Sears and they closed up your store and you don't have a job anymore. Like, why would you not allow partial payments and push for that person to, be able to not pay the fees for late rent and be kind to them? It's not consistent if you're doing that for government employees, but not for other employees who have lost their jobs to downsizing, in my opinion. So you guys can check out the link for this in the show notes if you're curious to read up a little bit more on it. But that's, I understand it. I get it. And you want to have a heart for people that are going through a tough time. But if you are going to do that, I'd say be consistent in the way you're doing it. Don't just try to ask for it because it's such a large scale issue right now with the government shutdown. So going over to NBC Los Angeles, we have an article written here by Elizabeth Marcelino, and this was written on January 16th, and it's saying that LA County is to prohibit landlord discrimination against Section 8 families. Well, it's kind of an interesting title because you shouldn't be discriminating against any families regardless of if they're on Section 8 or not. But the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors voted unanimously Tuesday to spend $5 million to prevent housing discrimination, including drafting an ordinance to prohibit landlords from denying renters who use Section 8 vouchers. Implementation of the nation's Fair Housing Act is 50 years overdue, Kuhl said. LA County is saying we will wait no longer. Discrimination in housing is exacerbating our housing and homelessness crisis by allowing landlords to discriminate and deny leases to families who want and can pay for housing. So going down a little bit further, it's saying that the motion was spurred by a Community Development Commission Housing Authority report that the county has less than 3% vacancy rate and discriminatory practices limit options for renters with Section 8 vouchers. In a 2016 survey of 5 cities conducted by the Urban Institute, 76% of landlords in the city of Los Angeles refused to accept vouchers. So you can check out the article in the show notes on from NBCLosAngeles.com if you want to learn more about that as well. We got an article coming from the Huffington Post written by Arthur Delaney, and this one is talking about how the government shutdown is hiking rents for hundreds of low-income tenants. So we covered this on a recent last week's episode, actually. But I wanted to get to this because this article is interesting. And it was just posted on the 19th, so it wasn't out when we were doing the podcast last week. And it's talking about the fact that a property management company told tenants in a letter this week that because of the shutdown, the federal government is no longer subsidizing their rent. And in it, they said, as of February 1st, 2019, all tenants were responsible for full basic rent. The company, Tri-State Management, confirmed it sent a letter to tenants at 28 buildings in Arkansas, Louisiana, Missouri, and Mississippi. Altogether, the apartments have 758 units. So an official at Tri-State told the Huffington Post that eviction proceedings could begin if the shutdown continues past February. I hope it doesn't come to that, the official said. I hope the government shutdown is over. So if the shutdown continues into February, rent hikes and eviction threats will probably spread as more landlords get antsy. The letter follows a similar note that a different Arkansas landlord sent to 50 properties last week. The landlord or the property manager in Arkansas, I read this article on a different blog post. They said that they were kind of a little bit early. They jumped the gun with their Section 8 employee or tenants. They said if they didn't pay for the rent in full by January 20th, which I think they were talking about for the next month, that they were going to be evicted. It turned out they did have funding. I guess they just didn't get the check or whatever in. But in their situation, they said the tough thing was, and this is what we were talking about last week, is that the normal people that they reach out to at HUD, they're furloughed. So they can't get an answer on anything. So It's not only the fact that funding is getting jammed up and we're going to run out of funding for these programs, but it's also the fact that the communication usually comes from the top down, but those people in those top positions aren't there. So it's just a bunch of people kind of shooting in the dark, hopefully handling things the right way. But to be honest, they don't know if they are or not. So this is going to be a mess that's just going to kind of keep unfolding until the shutdown ends. And we will cover it for you, see what else kind of unfolds within the next few weeks here as well. So the last story we have here, this one comes from NBC4i.com, and maybe you saw this one, but it says that a Silicon Valley landlord rents a $1,500 a month studio to 2 cats. Yep. This one comes from the Associated Press on January 17th, and it said that the 2 cats are living large at a $1,500 a month studio apartment their owner rents for them in Silicon Valley, where a housing shortage has sent rents skyrocketing. So if you're wondering, this $1,500 a month studio, it's 425 square feet. There's not even a kitchen in it. But so that the Mercury News reports the 20-pound cats named Tina and Luis moved to the studio in San Jose after their owner moved away to college. So the owner was a younger girl. Her dad didn't want to take care of the cats. I can't really figure this one out. So they just dumped the cats into the living space, and maybe the landlord lives in the house in front, which he does. He was planning on renting out this studio in the back on Airbnb, but he got this situation where he could add 2 cats to the studio and get $1,500 a month for it. Not too shabby, $750 per cat. I'm thinking, my first rents that I charged were about $300 per person when I was living with 2 friends inside of my apartment. So that's pretty great for this landlord. But just wanted to share this ridiculous story with you. And again, you can find all of these in the show notes. Yeah, like I said, it's getting kind of crazy, right? Whether it's rent control or government shutdown or emotional support alligators or, the situation in Jackson, Michigan. But, I guess it's also the day and age we live in. All this information can be disseminated so quickly to us, and you're hearing it now on the podcast and probably thinking, oh my gosh, I don't even know if I'd want to be a landlord or a property manager anymore, but there's good out there too. There's good things happening. Don't fall victim for, all the scary stories out there, because there's good stuff in the world. So, but that wraps up this week's episode. Until next week, thank you guys for listening. We'll be in touch soon. Have a great week.